Kurt Grimm is from Kansas. Kurt's got a really interesting agricultural background, a lot of involvement with a lot of different commodities, row crop, horticulture, specialty crops. And in addition to helping to run and manage the family's horticulture business, Kurt also helped found and start. He's the CEO of NutraDrip Irrigation Systems, a subsurface irrigation company. And so here today to share some of his insights with NutraDrip and this technology is Kurt Grimm.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Is the clicker? All right. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for sticking around. Hope to share some information and some things that we're doing in the Midwest that we found helpful. Certainly a long ways from home, so I guess I'm an expert, that means. So a little bit about our story and what we do. This is home for me. They're in Northeast Kansas. We're just straight south of Omaha, about 90 miles. On a family farm. We farm about 4,000 acres of corn and soybeans. We have center pivots, about almost 500 acres of subsurface drip irrigation now. We're a NetaFim drip irrigation dealer, so many of you have probably heard of NetaFim, kind of the world leader in drip irrigation. We have a garden center and landscape company, and I made a note there at the bottom that we don't have any livestock. I did grow up on a dairy farm, but today we don't have any livestock. This is what keeps me going every day. My wife and I have 8 children. Our oldest daughter just got married 2 weeks ago, so just entering a new phase of life. Like I mentioned, I was born on a dairy farm. My dad dairied until I was 4 years old, so I barely remember it. My uncles kept dairying, so I visited the farm often. But we moved to an adjacent farm about 4 miles away. In 1983, we had cattle, swine, sheep, and row crops. My dad's an idea guy. He's got a new idea every morning, and us boys had to learn how to sort through them. There's 5 boys in the family, and he wanted all of us to be able to come back to the farm in some capacity, and he succeeded at that. We're all doing something on our family farm there. 2 of my brothers farm full time. I have a brother that's a valley pivot dealer, and then 2 of us do drip irrigation. In 1993, in one of his ideas, we decided to build some greenhouses and got into hydroponic tomatoes, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's important in kind of our story. 1997, we put in our first center pivot. Our area of Kansas, we get about 30 inches of rain a year, so we typically haven't needed irrigation in the past, but we always go through those 3 or 4 weeks where irrigation would do a lot of good. So we kind of developed irrigation in our area. If you drill a well, you're good to get 10 gallon a minute. So an area that just does not have an aquifer underneath of it. So we had to figure out how to collect runoff water in reservoirs, and we kind of started a system where we're doing that today. And then in 2012, we had a severe drought, like most of the Midwest, and so that's kind of what led us into the drip irrigation. I'll show that field here in a little bit. And then in 2019, we did our first drip irrigation system with Manure. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well here and how we're doing that. This is where we're at today. We've installed systems kind of all over the Midwest. A bulk of our concentration is in Nebraska, western Iowa, up into the Minnesota and South Dakota, and down into southwest Missouri, and a few scattered projects here and there. So that's kind of where we work today. We've got a team put together of about 40 people that help us with this. So this is that first project we did in 1997 when we put that first pivot in, and you can see the reservoir there that we built catches runoff water. There's about 600 acres draining here, and we catch the runoff water in our rainy season, and then we were irrigating it on this center pivot here. We had this 40-acre piece over here that the pivot couldn't hit, and so we were looking for new innovative ways to irrigate that, had heard about drip irrigation and decided to give it a try. And to back up and kind of tie the story together a little bit, hydroponic tomatoes if you're familiar with that process, basically you have a soilless media. So there's no soil. The tomatoes grow in vermiculite or rice hulls is what we used at the time. And 100% of their fertility comes through the water. And so when we put that first drip system in, it was kind of a light bulb moment for me that now I have the level of control I had in my greenhouse. Now I have that in my cornfield. And so in the greenhouse, every week we would take a tissue sample, and we would measure the nutrient value in those plants, and we would determine If they were short of something, we could adjust that fertility in the water. We could adjust the flavor of those tomatoes. We could adjust the taste of them. We could put some Epsom salts in there and make the tomatoes have a lot more flavor. So when we took that concept of what can I do in a greenhouse, how do I apply that to a cornfield? And so I want to just paint this picture for you of a subsurface drip irrigation system. So this is what we're doing. We're burying a drip line 10 to 16 inches deep in a cornfield. We've done this on about 25,000 acres. And so it's not just for small fields anymore. We're doing some large projects. But think about the idea of being able to inject nutrients and manure during the growing season right into these corn plants. And so that's really what we're going to talk about here is how we're doing that, some of the equipment we're using to get manure separated, to get it clean enough. That's one of the big things we've had to figure out. So I'll talk a little bit about the drip system first, kind of explain what it is if you're not familiar with it, how it works. This is the NetaFim technology. The little drip line is either 7/8, 5/8, or 1 inch diameter. And they have little emitters that are extruded into them where the water drips out. We have pressure compensated and non-pressure compensated. So in our part of the country, it's a lot of rolling hills. So we have terraces and waterways in our area. So it's not a nice flat field. So we have to use pressure compensated. Puts out the same amount of water at the top of the hill as it does at the bottom. So pretty effective at irrigating and fertigating uniformly. This is the installation process. We use a 3-point implement, and basically it plows the drip line in, and then we come back and pack that shut, and then you can farm over the top of it. Typically, we're putting the drip lines 10 to 16 inches deep. We want to be 6 inches below the deepest tillage pass. So if you do some minimum till, vertical till, that's maybe down to 6 inches, then we would put the drip line in at 12. We don't want to be deeper than 16. If we get deeper than 16 inches, we're below the root zone, so to speak, and so it's not as effective. So we want to be somewhere in that 10 to 16 inch range to be effective with that. At each end of the field, we connect it to a manifold, and basically the manifold is tied into every single drip line, and so we're feeding a zone, if you want to think of it that way, and I'll show a map here in a little bit of kind of how the zones are split out. We do both PVC systems and HDPE. So the HDPE is all welded, especially on the manure systems we're doing in Minnesota where they get a lot of freeze-thaw effect and the soil moves a lot. We're using more of the HDPE up there just because it's a little more bulletproof. This is a 200-acre project we did in Iowa. So you can see the different zones. So we can water and fertigate each one of those zones independently. So if we've got different soil types, different crops, this particular grower has 3 different crops planted here, so he can manage each one of those blocks separately. So one of the advantages to any drip irrigation system is the ability to cover odd-shaped fields, and we can water 100% of the field. We're not going to miss part of it. This is another project in Iowa. This is a 700-acre field we did, and you can see he had looked at laying pivots out, and he could only catch about 500 of the 700. We were able to get 100% of that field with drip irrigation, and actually came in at a lower price per acre than what he was going to be with center pivot. So we feel like it's a good technology. It doesn't fit everywhere, but it's certainly something worth looking at. And as we talk about the manure side of it, there's some real major benefits there. Before the water and manure goes to the field, it's going to go through a filtration system. So these are sand media filters. Basically, the dirty water's coming in the top. It goes down through a bed of sand, and then the clean water comes out the bottom. It's an automatic backflush system. So we're measuring the pressure in and out. And when that differential gets to a set point, it triggers a backflush. So it automatically cleans itself. So you don't have to be out there babysitting it. So it's a pretty robust system. There's a lot of technology available today to monitor the system, so we can monitor flow and pressure. We can turn everything on and off remotely, run it from our phone and computer. So it's a pretty autonomous system. A few frequently asked questions on the drip side of this. I've covered a few of them already. 10 to 16 inches deep. The spacing between drip lines is either 30, 40, or 60, depending on soil type, crops you're growing. In a sandy soil, we're typically going to go 30 or 40 inches. If it's a really heavy clay, we can maybe get by with 60. I would say most of the systems we're doing with manure are either 30 or 40 inch. We do need fresh water, so when we talk about manure going with this, we do need fresh water even if we're not wanting to irrigate necessarily, just to flush the system. And we're going to need somewhere between 1 and 5 gallon per minute per acre is usually what we try to target. At 5 gallon per minute per acre, that allows a producer to apply a 1/4 inch of water per day or 1 inch every 4 days. So if you want to put 1 inch of water out, you run the system for 4 days and you've applied 1 inch. How long does it last? So 25 plus years is kind of our rule of thumb. We have a system in Nebraska that we did not install, but we maintain, and it is 39 years old and it's still running. So good water quality, good maintenance, those are keys to making a drip system last a long time. If you have poor water quality and don't maintain it, you could probably plug it up in 2 or 3 years if you ignored it. So it's a system that has to be managed. You can't just put it in and forget about it. The 2 minerals that cause problems with drip are iron and manganese. Those are the 2 minerals that will plug things up pretty quickly. And so we do a lot of work with water quality and water testing to make sure that we don't plug things up. Cost per acre, we're typically in that $2,000 to $3,000 an acre for a drip system, depending on the shape and size of the field and how much filtration is required. Is going to vary that cost quite a bit. Whether we need pressure compensating is a little bit more expensive. There are cost share programs available. The REAP program, so the energy program that pays for solar panels and lighting, that program also works for subsurface drip, so they will pay up to 50%. It is also an EQIP practice. So through NRCS, if you're converting from either flood irrigation, pivot irrigation, or traveling guns, or some kind of inefficient system and you convert to a drip system, there's a lot of EQIP money available for that. Every state pays at different rates, but typically they're paying somewhere between 50 and maybe even up to 70%. I'll mention I have climate, it is a climate smart practice. So I know sustainability was brought up in an earlier talk. It is definitely a practice that applies for climate smart. And I've got a couple slides later that kind of show some of those benefits. Maintenance for a drip system includes spring startup, winterization. From where I'm at, we blow these things out in the winter. Down here, I don't think that would be required. Acid treatment, so basically we're injecting acid in the drip line, and that cleans any minerals out that potentially would plug that drip emitter up. Things that can go wrong, rodents, so that's probably our number one thing that we're looking for in the field is if there's an existing population of ground squirrels or pocket gophers, those need to be eradicated first. If you put a drip system into a field that has a high population of rodents, they will chew on it. So we have a whole list of practices to do to help mitigate rodents. It's typically something we see in drier climates with sandy soil. So as you go west, I would say when you hit western Nebraska, go into Colorado, Arizona, they struggle with rodents a lot. When you get farther east in high rainfall areas, we typically don't see as much pressure. And then proper maintenance, training, and support. And that's really what our company, we're farmers first. And so we come at this from a farmer approach of how do I make this simple? How do I make it cost effective? There's got to be a payback on this. And so we have a whole agronomy program, which I'll talk about here in a little bit too. Now that we have this irrigation system, how do we use it to deliver those nutrients? Water and energy efficiency compared to flood or pivot, we're somewhere between 20 and 50% more efficient. Compared to flood, we're going to gain about 50%. Pivot's probably closer to 20 to 30, depending on the day, how much you're losing to evaporation there. So I'll talk a little bit about the agronomy side of this. And basically, I want you to think about when you think about a feed analysis of what you're feeding your cows, right? You measure that value of that feed, and you adjust the energy going into those cows every day. We're basically doing the same thing in the field. We're measuring those plants, and then we're adjusting what we're putting through the fertigation based on what that analysis says. So a couple things we like to do. This is a tissue sample that we take on corn over time. So basically, if you look at, I've got several different reference points here, but if you look across the bottom, starting at V2, so just, plant's about 3 inches tall, all the way up to dent, we're taking a tissue sample every single week. The green line, so notice the green line there on the top, and then the orange line, I have two different producers' values there. That top producer, that's Dan Lepkus in Illinois. He's kind of a celebrity farmer now that we work with. His yield range is around 350 to 370 bushel a year in and year out. He cranks that out. The orange line here, it's in east central Kansas, some really tough soil. He's more in that 200 to 250 bushel yield range. So one of the things we have here is we basically have benchmarks that say if you want to achieve a certain yield level, this is what your nutrient value needs to be. And then if you're lacking in that, what do we need to do to impact that during the growing season? So that's part of the management that we do with tissue sampling. Another component of management is soil moisture probes. No matter what kind of irrigation you do, I highly encourage you to use these. Maybe some of you are if you're using irrigation today. Basically, it's a sensor that goes in the ground, and it's about 48 inches long, and there's a sensor every 6 inches. So now I can see when I irrigate how deep in the profile did that water go. If we're only watering and the water's only going in 2 or 3 inches, then that's where all of our roots are going to be amassed at. If we can extend that root development out down to 10, 16, 18 inches, now we're going to be taking nutrients from all of that whole soil mass. And so Megan mentioned earlier and had a great slide on the soil is our sponge, right? And so if we can access more of that sponge with deeper rooting activity, we're going to get more goodies out of that soil, and we're going to have higher yield benefits and higher nutrient use efficiency, which is a big gain on some of the sustainability things that we're going after. So just want you to think about, especially when you have a subsurface drip irrigation system and you've got a line buried down here at 10 to 16 inches, you're never going to see the surface of the soil wet. You're not going to know if it's dry or wet. So soil moisture probes are kind of your best friend to know when do I need to water or not water. These probes have a lot of information on them. One of the things we can do here is we can see how deep the roots have gone. So if you notice all these little squigglies, those are day-night respiration. So every day the plant drinks, and then at night the soil rests. And so that's what happens on these stair steps is you've got the plant drinks, that's the drop, and then it levels off at night. Then it drinks during the day, then it drops at night. And so it allows us to see how deep the roots have gone in that soil profile. You can see here early in the season, you know, these deep sensors didn't have any movement until we got later into July, and now we've got roots all the way down here at this deep sensor, whereas early in the season we were getting a lot of movement up top. So there's a lot you can learn by using soil moisture probes. We're a big advocate for them. No matter what kind of irrigation you have, we feel like they're a really good tool to have. On the nutrient side, and I think this is especially applicable for manure, because one of the things we've learned with manure, it is an awesome plant food. I completely agree with what Megan said, that it is like it's the farmer's best friend. I mentioned earlier that we have 0 livestock on our farm, and the one reason I would potentially get livestock on my farm is because I want manure. There's no livestock in our area. We're not a big livestock raising region. So when I look at a nutrient analysis and I look at what manure has in it, it's basically a balanced recipe, but over time it causes imbalance if too much is applied. Too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, and that is definitely the case with some farms. As we look at soil samples and we look at what they've applied, there's certain things that get out of balance. And so when you look at the barrel on the left, or excuse me, on the right there, it's maybe something you've seen before, but I want you to think about it from the manure standpoint, where basically in order to raise a yield level in a field, we have to identify the most limiting nutrient. If we address that water is typically the first limiting thing on a farm. If we address water by adding irrigation, in order to raise the yield level further, we have to identify what the next lowest stave is. So it just gives a good visual of what those are. And typically, most farmers and agronomists, the easy button is nitrogen, right? We just want to put more nitrogen out. Or if we have manure, we just want to put more manure out. And a lot of times we actually can make the system go backwards by doing that, because we've oversalted something. We've put out too much of a good thing, and it's just like giving your kid candy. A couple's okay, but you give them a bunch and they're going to have a gut ache. And the same thing happens to a corn plant. You give that corn plant too much nitrogen, you actually plug up its vascular system, and it cannot move nutrients through the vascular system. So understanding the balance. And over on the left, it's called Mulder's chart. There's a lot of lines on there, and I'll just kind of give you a high-level overview of it. But basically what it's showing is that there is antagonisms and stimulations between different nutrients. In other words, if I put nitrogen out in my system, I'm actually being antagonistic against potassium. And I need potassium for fruit fill. That's what fills the kernels up in the corn ear. So there's antagonisms and there's stimulations and understanding which lever to pull and which button to push, and that changes every day as the plant photosynthesizes and it takes in that sunlight and has energy and it creates the starches and the sugars. These things change every day, and so it's a dynamic system that there's still a lot we don't know. 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was all about the chemical balance in the soil. And now we have hundreds of biological products out there to choose from to be able to make nutrients more available in the soil. And so we're understanding the synergies between biology and chemistry and how those things interact. When we look at this chart, all we have on here are the chemical side of it. This doesn't even have the biological side of it. And if we were to throw the biological side up here, we would have all kinds of squiggly lines because biology changes all of this. So just understanding that it's a very dynamic system, but to learn anything, you have to start measuring. You have to know what your starting points are. You have to know what some targets are. That's really the key takeaways. One of the things that's fun when you get this right is you understand what the potential is. This is the Beck's Research Farm in Indiana. We've done a lot of work with them. This is back in 2018, we put a drip system in for them. They had been raising 300 bushel dryland corn there. And one of their goals is they wanted to get to 400 bushel. And so we put a drip system in for them. This gray line at the bottom is their county average. So they're in an area that's typically, 170 to 200 bushel dryland. They were raising 300 bushel just by intense management. Then we added irrigation to the mix, and we've gotten their dryland yields up into that 380 to 400. So when you get that balance right, the potential for increased production is incredible. As you probably know, there's corn producers in Georgia that have hit over 600 bushels. So those are some of the things that we know are possible. And so we're always looking at what are those next steps. If most producers are averaging 200, but yet you've got some high yielding guys hitting 600, we know there's a 3x growth potential out there, and so trying to unlock what those things are. So thinking about how a corn plant grows, how it brings in nutrients, what nutrients does it need when. This is a nitrogen uptake chart for corn for a 230 bushel yield target. And so what we've got here across the bottom is we've got emergence all the way to maturity. So this is growing degree units here. And you can see from this time period of V10, V9 right in here, all the way through R1, like 80% of the nitrogen is used in this 21-day period. And it's 7 pounds per day. And so one of the things I want you to think about, especially as you think about manure and manure application, and I think I'm going to jump to the next slide because it kind of shows this. When you apply one large amount of manure one time per year, you're expecting it to be available when that plant needs it. And one of the things that we've identified is that soil is a sponge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that nutrients are available to that plant when the plant wants it. In other words, you put it in the soil and it's not available. The plant can't get it off of that soil colloid. I was with an agronomist last week, and one of the things he said is the worst place to store nutrients is in the soil because the soil binds them up, especially if you have heavy clay soils. There's cations and anions and that whole plant energy balance, and it gets bound up on the soil. And so what would happen if we could take nitrogen, and this is really what we've done in our drip systems, is we've said, okay, we're not going to put all the nitrogen out at once. We're going to put it out as the plant needs it. Now we have we've pretty much doubled our nitrogen use efficiency number. In other words, traditionally, a corn producer would be using 1 to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen to produce a bushel of corn. We've lowered that number to about 0.6 or 0.7. So we're using half as much nitrogen per bushel. What about manure? What about when we put 100% of our manure on in the fall or spring before we plant the crop? We get multiple rain events, right? Rainy seasons in the spring a lot of times. Is that nitrogen still available and in the right form for that crop to use it? And in a lot of cases, what we see is we go out and we do tissue sampling and we measure what's going on in the field. We don't have what we need when we need it. And so that crop is starving, and we're starving it, and that's why we're losing a lot of yield potential. One of the other things that I want you to think about as we look at this subject to loss slide, push the wrong button here. So we think about nitrogen subject to loss. What about groundwater? What happens to those nitrates when we put it all out there and we're expecting it to be available for the plant 6 months later, right? Let's say we put it out in November, October, November, and that plant needs it next July. What are we seeing when we get these maps from the universities and people doing the studies that say nitrate in the groundwater, in shallow groundwater that's been recently charged, or deeper groundwater that's used for drinking water? We work in Nebraska. This is a very hot topic in Nebraska. They're pointing the finger at farmers. Farmers are to blame, and you can argue that point back and forth. I think some of that nitrate has been in the system a lot longer than farmers have been farming. But ultimately, there's some impact there. As I looked at Georgia, I mean, there's certainly some areas in Georgia that have some nitrate and groundwater issues as well. And I think this is going to be a bigger and bigger target that farmers have on their back, is how are we managing nitrogen, and where's that nitrogen going after we apply it? So we have to be thinking about how do we do things better. I'll talk a little bit about some other measuring that we do in the field to optimize production. This is one of the studies my brothers on the farm did, where we looked at corn emergence and how that ends up impacting yield. So basically what we do is we go out, plant a field, and you see all these little different color flags. Each color represents a 12-hour window. So in other words, we plant the crop, and we know that within about 48 hours, we could have some plants start popping out of the ground. So we go out and we flag all the plants that popped out in the next 12 hours with a certain color. Then 12 hours later, we come out and we flag those plants. And what I want you, this is a really busy slide, but basically what we did is we did this for the width of our planter. So we have a 24-row planter, and we did that for every row in the planter. And kind of the takeaway message here is on that 24-row planter, my highest yielding individual row was 290 bushel. My lowest yielding row was 213 bushel. So I have an 80 bushel yield difference just within the variability on my planter. And so these are all the different kinds of things that we measure. Something's wrong with the planter, right? The planter is not optimized. It's not performing properly. It's not putting the seed in at the right depth, and it's not closing the trench right. So these are all the things we have to look at. And I think that the take-home message here is it's a system approach, right? It's not like we just put a drip system in and our yield automatically jumps to 400 bushel. We have to address all of the limiting factors along the way to make sure that we can optimize what we're getting out of the system. From a producer standpoint, one of the reasons that this matters immensely is because for you to go buy more land today, at least in our neighborhood, we're looking at $10,000 to $15,000 an acre. 30 years ago, when I graduated from high school, or 25 years ago when I graduated from high school, I bought a quarter section for $2,000 an acre, right? Land values have exponentially grown. You can't buy more land economically at 7% interest. So we've got to figure out how do we make more yield out of land we already have. And that's really one of the big take-home messages I want you to get. Another thing I want to talk a little bit about, because I just had a conversation with a producer yesterday here from Georgia, and this is showing up on his farm in a big way, is water quality matters. This is a center pivot. This is actually that very first center pivot that we put in on our farm, and this is the yield map from 2020. And you can see the center pivot, it sweeps right here, and it goes around like this. The outside of the pivot, this is a year that we had really good rainfall. I think it rained, our dryland corn was making around 250 bushel. And underneath the pivot was about 29 bushel less. So in other words, it yielded more where we didn't irrigate it. We didn't irrigate very much, but we're seeing this more and more. I've got another slide here of a center pivot in Nebraska. You can see inside the pivot, that crop is suffering in a big way. And one of the things that we're learning, or we've kind of uncovered in this process of trying to figure out what's going on, is there are things in water that tie up nutrients in the soil. So this is a water sample test. Now, a lot of numbers on here. I don't expect you to remember any of them, but the one that I want to stick in your mind is a nutrient, or it's a salt that's called bicarbonates. And basically bicarbonates bind up cations in your soil, and so they make nutrients unavailable. So just to kind of give you a rough idea what this means, if you apply 9 inches of water, so let's say during the growing season you put 9 inches of irrigation water out, you have tied up 1,200 pounds per acre of cations in your soil. Cations are potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sodium. Now, sodium we don't care about, but we care a lot about potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And we just offset or tied up 1,200 pounds of them by irrigating 9 inches of water because we didn't address this issue. So if you're seeing things on your farm where you're like, man, I've irrigated, my yield should be higher than this, I've addressed the water, there are other things happening in that water and that this needs to be treated. It is a treatable issue, and so this is something that we're focusing pretty heavy on. One of the reasons that this is, it's not an old issue, it's kind of a new issue. And one of the reasons, this is the pH of rainfall over the last, since 1995. So if you look at the pH of rainfall in 1995, we were in that 3.5 to 4 range. Look at the last 10 years, really. Our pH has climbed all the way up to 6. Do you know how you fix bicarbonates? With acid. So every time it was raining before 2015, it fixed the problem for us. They've cleaned all the sulfur out of the air. We've raised the pH of rainwater. So I go out periodically and I check the pH of our rainwater at home. The last time, I didn't check it last time, but last fall I checked it, we were at 6.2. So we've climbed on up above 6 now. And so every time it rains, it's not fixing that problem for us that we used to have. So this is one of the reasons that I think this bicarbonate issue is showing up in a lot bigger way. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more here about the manure separation side and kind of how we got into that. The 4 R's of nutrient management, it's a terminology that came from the fertilizer industry where they talk about the right time, the right place, the right amount, and the right source. So in other words, they want to use fertilizer products, synthetic fertilizers that do these, that check these 4 boxes. And so how do we do that with manure? And when you look at what comes out of a cow, this is some research done in California. It wouldn't be hard to do though on any farm. Every day, that cow is kicking out 120 pounds of manure. And if you boil that down into the nutrient content per day, we're getting about 0.6 pounds of nitrogen, 1/4 pound of phosphorus, and 1/2 pound of potassium. Obviously, that's going to vary a little bit on every farm. But if we break that down per day, we've got 60 cents per head per day of value. Megan hit the nail on the head. Look at manure as an asset, right? This is 60 cents of value that you have coming out of that cow every day. How do you capture that? How do you utilize that? I've got the same exact question here. Is it an asset or a liability? So these are all questions that Megan kind of already touched on. So a little bit about our story, how we got into taking manure through drip. We had put a drip system in for one of our neighbors back in 2017, 18, somewhere in there. And he had a hog farm. He had a lagoon by his hog barn. And he's like, why can't I take, or can I take my lagoon water and put that through my drip system? Like, well, we had heard they had been doing some of it in California on some dairies. So we thought, well, let's find out what they did out there. So we took a trip to California, looked at some of their systems, decided this was doable. So basically what we did on the lagoon system is we set up a river screen, which is not a new piece of technology. We modified, or they modified some stuff for us. So we have a 120 mesh screen on the outside of it, has an electric drive and some some spray jets on it. So basically what we're doing in this situation is we're just taking the liquid off the top of the lagoon. We're leaving the solids in the lagoon. We're not messing with them. This is a very simple way to do this. It only works on lagoons that have less than 2% solids. And that's kind of a key number to remember. If we get higher than 2%, the river screen is not really an option. It plugs up too quick. So then kind of fast forward, we started doing that on his farm. He's been doing it now for 5 years successfully. We've done it on several other lagoons. Then we had a large dairy come to us from Minnesota and said, hey, we've got some lagoons. We want to take our, the first thing they wanted to address was their silage runoff water. They had to capture all of their runoff water off their silage pads, and it has a tremendous odor to it because they have a covered lagoon, so it doesn't gas off. There's no aeration in it, and so it smells really, really bad. They tried to run it through pivots, and you would gag when you drove by it. It smelled so bad. So like, why? Let's try a drip system for that. So we did that. To date, we've done, I think, 15 systems for that dairy now. And basically at every one of their sites, we have a quarter section of drip that we put their manure, or we put their leachate through. And now we've started doing manure with them as well. So through that process, we put together a trailer where basically we have a couple of our proprietary pieces of equipment that we're using. The first one that really changed the game for us is this machine here that's called a microfilter. Through our connections with Netafim in Israel, that's where they're based at, they had been working with a company in Italy that had made this unit here. It's called a microfilter. And basically what it is, there's a drum on the inside that's spinning, and I'm going to play a little video here. And basically it throws the liquid through a 25 micron screen. So it's a very fine screen, and we get the video's not going to work. Maybe it's not going to go. Anyhow, it basically, it looks like a chocolate fountain is what it looks like. So when it's coming, it's not a chocolate fountain, of course, it's manure, but it's a very simple piece of equipment. It does a beautiful job of separating the small particles out of the manure. This is what I would consider a second stage separation. In other words, there has to be a screw press or a slope screen in front of this that would take out the large particles, and then this would take out the small particles. So it's kind of it's a second stage piece of equipment that takes out the little pieces. Let's see, it's a low horsepower requirement. That's another key benefit to it. So basically the plumbing here, we're feeding it in through this line right here. The clean material comes out the bottom. The dirty sludge comes out this top port here. And we basically send that back in front of the screw press and let it go through the process again. So we'll put it back in the lagoon or wherever we're pulling the material from. And we just keep circulating that through because we can get greater and greater capture rates on the screw press if as we thicken that. 15 horsepower, so low horsepower requirement. As I've kind of been through different manure systems, I look at the performance of this unit, and I would say it's similar to a centrifuge or a system with polymer. So if you are familiar with those, this would be a replacement for those at a much, much lower price point. We can get about 100 gallon a minute of clean product through one of these units. I mentioned in there that it was a 25 micron, and so I was trying to find a relative measurement of what 25 micron is because that's really hard to visualize. So this is a hair, a human hair is 50 to 180 micron. A white blood cell is 25 micron. So 25 micron is very, very small. It's a matter of fact, if you fill that drum up with water, just plain water, the water won't even come through the screen. You have to turn the drum on to get the water to go through, even if there's no manure in there. One of the big benefits that we've seen on some farms is that phosphorus buildup in the soil samples has gotten so high that some farms can no longer apply manure because their phosphorus levels are too high. The microfilter on dairy and beef manure is removing 70 to 90% of the phosphorus from the liquid. So when you look at, what I've got here is the blue line is our source, so that would be coming right out of the lagoon or the pit. After the screw press, so that's kind of our first stage, we took manure samples, and you can see we're not removing hardly any nitrogen out of there. On the screw press, we take out a little bit of phosphorus, and then we don't take out hardly any potassium. But then when we go through the microfilter, again, nitrogen stays about the same, phosphorus is about this, or excuse me, potassium is about the same, but phosphorus, we're taking 70 to 90% of that out of there as we go through that process. So very effective at removing phosphorus. It puts it into that dry solids. And so now you have a dry solid that you can haul to a farm and spread that maybe where that's not adjacent to your dairy or livestock, and that needs the phosphorus, or sell it to a neighbor or compost it. There's a lot of things you can do with those dry solids. So it's kind of a value add product. Talk a little bit about return on investment and how does this pay. This is a case study we did in Minnesota on a farm where basically we looked at a drip system versus a center pivot, where the drip system was more expensive. Typically drip is more expensive than a pivot on a wide open field. And in about year 6 is where the drip system gains its advantage. And it gains the advantage by increased production and being able to cover all the acres. Typically it's a little higher CapEx cost on the upfront side. I mentioned earlier that greenhouse gases and sustainability, I know that's something that is super important to some people. Others are not as interested in that. But they've quantified this in California, up to an 85% reduction in greenhouse gases because we're putting the manure underneath the ground. So when manure is applied through a center pivot or through flood irrigation, which is the way they were doing it in California, there's a lot of gas emissions, a lot of methane, things are leaving, going up in the atmosphere. When everything is done underneath the ground in low quantities during the growing season, we're reducing up to 85% of those greenhouse gases. So a big win for producers there as well. So that's what I've put together. That's a little snippet of what we do. We'll take any questions and open to discussion. Yes. Struvite, good question. So, yeah, we're running into struvite. I think so, and actually we're kind of looking at struvite from 2 different angles. Number one, obviously it plugs up pipes, creates problems. Struvite is a reaction, as you probably know, of a balance of nutrients, right? There's got to be the pH has to be right. There's got to be the right amount of, I think it's calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. It's basically like a kidney stone in your pipe. And so as we take things out, we mess that balance up. And so the struvite hopefully won't build up as fast. I don't have enough experience to say, yes, we're going to fix struvite. We just installed one of these systems on a research farm in Missouri, and they are dealing with struvite existing. And so it's going to be a real live case study of, okay, we're stripping all this phosphorus out now. Do we get rid of your struvite issue? The number one fix to struvite is larger diameter pipes. So if you're going in and having to do replumbing, put in bigger diameter, because struvite is one of the ways you make struvite is you create a restriction, and restriction and velocity make struvite form. The reason I bring that up is because we're actually looking at struvite as a potential way to create a salt fertilizer from manure. So we're doing some research right now trying to see, can I make struvite and then harvest it? Because struvite is actually something you can harvest and then sell it as a salt fertilizer. So there's some companies out there that have done some work around that. So we're kind of looking at it from 2 different angles. First, can I prevent it? And then can I make it happen and then harvest the struvite? Yes.
I have 2 questions. Thank you for your presentation. On the REAP grant that you discussed, is that only going to be replacement or new?
That is replacement also. Yep, has to be replacement.
And then when you talked about the water quality and checking that, if you're looking at purchasing land and you're wanting to do some water quality testing, where would you recommend doing that?
So I would try to get some adjacent wells that are in the same aquifer. So basically what you have to do is the water quality is going to be specific to that aquifer. So if you know that the aquifer you're going to pull from is 100 foot deep and you can find an adjacent well that's in that aquifer, that will at least get you a representative value. That's probably the best you're going to be able to do.
And what about lab?
Most labs, we use Ward Lab in Nebraska primarily. Ward Lab in Kearney is a really good one that we use.
Questions? Oh, we got one back there.
What dry matter?
Go ahead in the back.
What dry matter is the sludge coming out of the microfilter before you add it to the fiber?
Yeah, it's going to be around 20%. So the sludge is, actually it's going to be about 12%. 12% dry matter. So it's going to be similar consistency to what comes out of the cow. It looks like a cow pie. If you put it on the ground, it's going to look like a cow pie. Yep. So
Thank you.
it kind of thickens that liquid back up.
What's the price of that piece of equipment?
The microfilters are around 60,000, rough cost. Yep. So not super expensive when you compare it, say, to a centrifuge or something.
High operating cost?
How high operating cost? It's a 12 horsepower motor, so very low operating cost, 100 gallon a minute.
It doesn't wear out like screw presses.
No, it depends on how much sand you have in your manure. That's going to be one thing we're going to try to get out, is make sure we've got all the sand out. So we're doing some things with centrifuges, or not centrifuges, a centrifugal separator to make sure we have the sand out. Because if there's still sand stuck to those fiber particles, it will create higher wear on them, on the drum and on the screen. Yep.
I think that's it.
You're good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt.
Appreciate it.
All right, and with that, that is our last speaker here at the Georgia Dairy Conference. We appreciate everyone sticking around through the end. Couple of housekeeping notes for our Georgia producers that are looking for their CAFO continuing education credits.